Hello, I'm Sebastian Michael, and this is this Saturday's sonnet. How sweet and lovely dost thou make the shame, which like a canker in the fragrant rose, doth spot the beauty of thy budding name. Oh, in what sweets dost thou thy sins enclose! That tongue that tells the story of thy days, making lascivious comments on thy sport, cannot this praise but in a kind of praise, naming thy name blesses an ill report. Oh, what a mansion have those voices got, which for their habitation chose out thee, where beauty's veil doth cover every blot, and all things turns to fair that eyes can see. Take heed, dear heart, of this large privilege. The hardest knife ill used doth lose his edge. And this is the astonishingly assertive and angry, almost, Sonnet 95. Now I say almost angry because we have not really heard Shakespeare, me the poet, so worked up about anything since the epic rant. You may remember the epic rant a little while ago when I went on about how everything was bad and how the state of England itself was corrupt. And really not since then have we heard quite such a strong voice. This is very different to anything we've heard before. This is a new tone, this is a new key that we now arrive at again, and that's why it's so interesting, and that's why of course I've chosen it for this week's sonnet, because we hear a new William Shakespeare here. Because remember, I have been angry with the youth before, I've been jealous, I've been disappointed, and I've said so, but in the past I have been very, very quick to forgive, and I have followed my disappointment or my anger by saying, it's all right, that's what somebody who is as beautiful and as young as you will do. When the young man went off with none other than my own mistress, I was heartbroken. I described the bad weather I suddenly found myself in, and then within the same sonnet I said, but those tears are pearl that thy love sheeds, and they are rich and ransom all ill deeds. Well, there is, interestingly enough, a tone of reconciliation about to come, but it comes a little bit later, and also it comes in a very different vein. And the key change that has happened sustains for a while. There is not only a change of tone, there's also a change of rhythm now in terms of the frequency in which the sonnets most likely are written. And so we need to ask, or we can ask, of course, because that's the interesting thing to ask here, is what happened? What brings this key change about? Why am I suddenly so different in my response to whatever it is the young man has done? And whatever the young man has done is clearly something that has changed my attitude to him. I have ventured in the last episode that we are now coming into the last phase of the Fair Youth sonnets. We are now at number 95. There are 126 that are considered to be addressed to the fair youth, and that means that we are now probably in the last act, and we can hear this. This is this key change that's happening. If the Fair Youth sonnets in themselves were a self-contained 3-act play, I think this is where we would enter the third act. What brings this about? What has happened? We don't know, obviously, precisely, because, as you know, as I've said many times now, we are going by the words and only by the words. But we can ask what leads up to this extraordinary admonition. I'm admonishing the youth here, and I'm warning him. It's a warning, saying, take heed, dear heart. You are overstepping a mark. Now you've gone maybe already one step too far. This is now doing serious damage, not only to your reputation, not only to me emotionally, but to our relationship and to your actual status in the world. Let's find out how we got here. You may remember that in the last episode I was in a state of uncertainty, and I said, if you are going to hate me, do so now. Make the first cut the deepest. Come in the onset of this trouble I have. I reiterated the trouble I have, the way in which I am underappreciated and in which fortune is not being kind to me, the spites of fortune I mentioned. And I said, well, if you are going to do this most terrible of things, which is to leave me, then do so now. And the last sonnet in last week's batch had a slight change of tone, where I said, well, other people have all manner of things in which they glory, that they enjoy, things that they are proud of, or things that they relish. And I have the most precious thing of all. I have you. And the only thing that troubles me is that you might take that most precious thing of all away from me, which is you. So again, I said, I have you, that we are together, that you are mine. I claim this kind of possession. And you will know, bracket here, because I have said so in one of the episodes, of course, that I consider this whole series of sonnets to chart a game not only of love and chance, if you like, but also of passion, power and possession. And again, if I say, thy love is better than high birth to me, richer than wealth, prouder than garments cost, of more delight than hawks or horses be, and having thee of all men's pride I boast. Wretched in this alone, that thou mayst take all this away, and me most wretched make. Well, certainly the language suggests a notion of possession. How literally we may have to take this, I don't know. But we have also made reference to the puns that Shakespeare employs, and he does it again here. He says, of all men's pride I boast. Make of that what you will. I don't want to read too much into it. I just want to make ourselves aware that this language is being used. And this was at the end of last week's batch. So what happened after that? How did we get from that to this warning? And 92 continues the vein of uncertainty. And I conclude that particular sonnet with the sentence, thou mayst be false, and yet I know it not. So either I'm being disingenuous and I'm saying, well, I know full well that you're being false, but I pretend not to know. Or I'm saying, I really don't know, I can't trust you. I have a slight feeling it might be the former, actually, because of what's about to come in Sonnet 93. So shall I live, supposing thou art true, like a deceived husband. And that's an interesting word to use here, and it's not the only time I do this in the whole series, that I essentially equate our relationship to a marriage. It's a kind of marriage, and here I position myself as the deceived husband. And I even explain how I effectively kid myself. I say, so love's face may still seem love to me, though altered new, thy looks with me, thy heart in other place. And I conclude this particular sonnet with, how like Eve's apple doth thy beauty grow, if thy sweet virtue answer not thy show. Which is effectively saying your beauty turns into Eve's apple. Remember, Eve's apple is the seductive lure of falseness, if you like, because it leads to ejection from paradise ultimately. It's the apple that is the forbidden fruit, after all. If thy sweet virtue answer not thy show, if your behavior, if what you do is not equal to what you look. In other words, if you're only beautiful externally, but your character, your behavior, the way you comport yourself, the things that you do not follow that beauty. So a clear indication again that the young man is getting off with other people. Clearly, we don't know who this is. We don't know whether this has anything to do with yet another woman. I'm not saying so. I'm not saying who this is. I certainly don't seem to claim possession, as I did in the past, of the person the young man is having affairs, almost you could say adulterous affairs with. I mean, I use this word very slightly ironically because of course Shakespeare is married elsewhere. Or is it the poet? Because remember, this all comes out of a series of sonnets which addressed the fact that there is another poet on the scene, that there's a rival on the scene. And those sonnets also quite strongly suggest that there may be a sexual relationship between the young man and this rival poet. That was certainly hinted at. These hints were dropped quite heavily. The punning there was quite clear, or certainly very suggestive. So maybe this is still the same person. We don't know. We can only speculate. But what we can be pretty certain of is that there is somebody in the equation, that the young man is having affairs or relationships, sexual relations, most likely with this person or these persons. And then 94 goes a step further in this stance, which says, I cannot be sure about what you're doing. I have a feeling you're being unfaithful to me. I have a feeling that you are beginning to behave in a reprehensible way, because now I say, the summer's flower is to the summer sweet, though to itself it only live and die. But if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. The really interesting thing in this particular sonnet, I think, is this vocabulary, because if you go by the words, and the vocabulary here becomes very, very strong and very evocative of something that's basically wrong. Because remember, I have at the beginning, quite a while ago, I have not been able to compare the youth to a summer's day, because he was even more lovely and more temperate. And now I say that the sweet flower of summer is sweet. But if this sweet flower with infection meet, we don't know what kind of infection, but it's a word that certainly suggests being tarnished, being eaten into, and could well have a sexual connotation. It could well refer to a sexual infection. Remember, in those days, it is not at all unlikely that somebody who sleeps around, somebody who has many sexual partners, may contract any number of diseases. Sexually transmitted diseases are rife, so the word here may not be coincidental. The basest weed, even the most base weed, becomes more dignified than that sweet summer flower. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Weeds kind of are already what they are, but also they're robust, is the suggestion. Whereas lilies, beautiful flowers, when they start to fester, they smell far worse than weeds. It's an incredible thing to say to this young nobleman, because remember, we have established what a high status this young man has, and in the past I have deferred to him. Even when I've been disappointed with him, I have taken a step back, because of course you can do whatever you need to do. Of course, I am your slave, I have said. And now I'm saying, you may be a beautiful lily, but the things you do cause you to be infected, and that makes you even worse than the basest weed. Strong things to say to somebody, especially if you love them. That's a change of positioning, a change of attitude, a change of stance. Then we get, how sweet and lovely dost thou make the shame. Again, strong word there. So, might as well just get to it. What does it mean? Sonnet 95. It's another one of those that are not particularly difficult to understand. How sweet and lovely dost thou make the shame, which like a canker in the fragrant rose doth spot the beauty of thy budding name. Well, thy budding name, let's start there, is of course your young reputation. It's established, we've said it, I've just said it again, this is a young nobleman who's very rich, very high status, he's very close to power, he's very highly regarded by virtue of his name, and this is a budding reputation because he's young, of course. And any nobleman in Shakespearean England in the time of the very old Queen Queen Elizabeth. This may already be getting towards King James. We don't know for certain yet, but end of the 16th century, very early 17th century. Around that time, if you're a young nobleman, your reputation is your currency, really. You have to have a good reputation. It's all about that. And this is your budding reputation. As a young man, you're beginning to establish your reputation. And this shame which you've incurred, or which you are incurring, does spot the beauty of your budding name. Of course, I have used the word beautiful and beauty about you and your appearance before, and it makes sense, certainly I think, to a Shakespearean mentality, to that age, that beauty and reputation, nobility and beauty are tied together, really. If you're a good person, you're also a beautiful person ordinarily, and if you are a noble, rich, wealthy and powerful person who's also good, then that is why you would be so beautiful. And here the beauty of your name is being tarnished by this shame you have incurred. And this shame is doing so, it is spotting the beauty of your reputation like a canker in the fragrant rose. And canker comes up over and over again in Shakespeare's sonnets. Canker is an infestation. It's a little worm that infests flowers and makes them rot prematurely and disfigures them. Very likely, I think, although we can't be certain, but very likely that this may be reference to some sexually transmitted disease. It could be purely symbolic. Don't get me wrong. This is pure conjecture. We don't know for certain. It's just that because the language that I use here, starting with shame and what's about to come, I think this may well point to an actual physical infestation or infection. Oh, in what sweets dost thou thy sins enclose? I use the word sins. Now, I'm not the most sanctimonious of people. Again, I remind ourselves that when you previously had a thing with my mistress, I was quick to forgive. Within the same sonnet, I started to forgive you. I also have affairs myself. We know this from the sonnets themselves, because I've admonished you in the past for getting off with my own mistress. So I'm not the most moralist, sanctimonious git around. But here, strong language, shame, sin, base infection, that seems to suggest to me that the young man is behaving in a way which endangers him and possibly also me. Of course, it's just a thought because of the language I find in here. Oh, in what sweets dost thou thy sins enclose? Well, your sweets is your beauty. Again, this is an observation how your beautiful appearance encloses this shadowy, murky, appalling behaviour that I seem to suggest you indulge in. That tongue that tells the story of thy days, the tongue is really the language here, the voice, the whatever is written or said about you and about your days, the story of you, your biography, if you like, whatever language they use, making lascivious comments on thy sport, even if they are quite explicit, quite sexually explicit about your sport. Your sport here again has to be, I think, almost certainly understood as your escapades, your sexual transgressions. Cannot dispraise, but in a kind of praise, even if they were to name explicitly what you're doing and were to be disparaging about you, they would still end up praising you in a way, because naming thy name blesses an ill report, because that's the way it is. You have because of who you are, everything that you do turns out to be a good thing after all. I mean, I'm being sarcastic here. I don't actually think that I believe this now. This is an observation that I don't sound happy about. And I say so because of what's about to come. Oh, what a mansion have those vices got, which for their habitation chose out. The vices, these bad behaviors, these sinful, shameful things that you do, what a mansion they have found in you, what a beautiful building, what a beautiful home they have got for themselves when they sought out you. It's a wonderful way of putting it. Where beauty's veil doth cover every blot. The veil of beauty covers everything. The varnish of beauty covers over all the cracks of your rotten character, is what I seem to be suggesting. And all things turns to fair that eyes can see, and turns everything beautiful. There's a lot of discussion about whether it should be all things turns to fair or all things turn to fair. In the quarto edition, the one that we have, the first edition that we have, it says turns to fair. It makes perfect grammatical sense. I don't see any reason to change it. There's a slight difference in meaning. It either means where beauty's veil doth cover every blot is the one thing that happens, and all things turn to fair that eyes can see is the other thing that happens. That's what some editors do. Or it means where beauty's veil doth cover every blot, beauty's veil does one thing, it covers every blot, and the other thing it does, beauty's veil, is and all things turns to fair that eyes can see. It's just that the subject, if in the original version, remains beauty's veil, and it makes perfect sense, so why change it? And then this incredible final couplet. Take heed, dear heart, of this large privilege. The hardest knife ill-used doth lose his edge. You may think of yourself as a diamond. You may have the highest reputation in the world, or certainly in the world that I know, in England. You may be almost unassailable in your beauty, in your status, but beware, you are taking this too far. And even your sharpness may be blunted by what you're doing. And this is a radical change of tone. That's why it's so interesting. It marks a change in the relationship. I am asserting myself. I'm saying I can see you in a different light. I can see you maybe for what you are here. Now we have to be a bit careful, because of course what comes next is another sonnet, and this next sonnet already changes the tone a little bit again. But the reason I am quite certain that this phase in the proceedings and this particular sonnet mark a change of attitude, a change of position, mark a change in the relationship, is because of what's about to come, not only in the next few sonnets in this week's batch, but also in the following week's batch. A look ahead, what we will find is that the things I talk about change. The frequency with which I write appear to change from what I'm saying, and I think this is a new phase. I think something has happened now in this relationship that makes me almost grow up a bit, almost see this young man in a different light. It's almost as if something has dropped. This veil of beauty that I refer to, maybe it's slipping a bit. Maybe I'm beginning to see a different young man. Remember also, of course, the time passes all the time. This man is growing up, and I think I am growing up a little bit as well in my emotional relationship with him. I take a very different position. And what comes next in this week's batch, some say thy fault is youth, some wantonness, some say thy grace is youth, some gentle sport. So I'm kind of putting this a little bit in context. I say, well, maybe this is the fault of your youth, because you are still young after all, even though you are now growing up. Then I say, well, even the basest jewel, I again use the word base, and I compare your behavior to a base jewel, but on the finger of a queen, even the basest jewel shines beautifully. So are these errors that in thee are seen, to truths translated, and for true things deemed. And so even though you are full of error, even though you are behaving badly, in you they become truth. I almost say the same thing as I said before, and I seem to mellow a little bit in my language here. And then a plea to the young man, after having given this warning, take heed, you're about to do serious damage here. Now in 96, a plea Because I say, how many lambs might the stern wolf betray, if like a lamb he should his looks translate? How many gazers mightst thou lead away, if thou wouldst use the strength of all thy state? But do not so. I love thee in such sort, as thou being mine, mine is thy good report. So, like a wolf in sheep's clothing, you could go and seduce all manner of people. You could get away with it. But do not so. I love thee in such sort, as thou being mine, mine is thy good report. And we've heard these two lines before. We've heard these two lines before in sonnet number 36, when the constellation was that I said to you, the young man, my reputation is tarnished and your association with me is damaging your reputation. Therefore, dissociate yourself from me. I may not evermore acknowledge thee, lest my bewailed guilt should do thee shame. Nor thou with public kindness honour me, unless thou take that honour from thy name. And then I said, but do not so. In other words, do not take that honour from your name through being associated with me. Do not so. I love thee in such sort, as thou being mine, mine is thy good report. So thou being mine, because we are one, because you and I are one, your good reputation is also mine. So protect your good name, and that will also then reflect on me indirectly. So I said to him then, in number 36, quite a while ago, now that my reputation is damaged, now that your association with me brings you into a bad light, do not do so. Do not acknowledge me. Do not damage your reputation, because your good reputation is also mine. And here in 96, 60 sonnets later, I used the same two lines. You could go off and have affairs with all manner of people, but do not so. I love thee in such sort, as thou being mine, mine is thy good report. It's almost like saying, if you continue to damage your reputation, to behave badly, that also reflects on me. If that's what I mean by this, then that's an interesting reversal of positions. If it's a coincidence, it could be a coincidence. It's not unheard of for a writer to use the same phrase because he's forgotten that he's done so. I mean, this has happened to me, Sebastian Michael, as a writer. I've written something down, so that is quite a nice way of putting this. And then later, yes, I've used this before. I'm actually quoting myself. It's possible that I, Shakespeare here, use the same two lines without remembering that I've used them before. But it's also possible, of course, that I make reference to 36 and I say, remember that then, this is now. And it's open to us to interpret this whichever way we like. We get into the territory of conjecture here. And this marks almost a kind of conclusion, because the next two sonnets in this week's batch talk about something different in a different tone. They talk about how like a winter had my absence been, and they talk about how I've been away from you during the summer, but even though it was summer and the season was warm and lovely, it felt like a winter because I was away from you. And this suggests that somewhere here at around 96 I take my leave from you for quite a long time. And that also suggests that there's a gap between these sonnets that we've just talked about, all of the things with the rival poet and with these affairs that the young man is having, and these next two, 97, 98. And what we don't know, of course, is whether that means that 95, how sweet and lovely dost thou make the shame, whether this is written from a distance or whether this is still while they're together, we can't be certain here. But what certainly seems to happen is that I am now either about to go away or I'm already away from you, and this is during a summer. And we know that Shakespeare had many reasons to travel. He was, after all, an actor in a touring company, and they tended to travel in the summer. And also we know that Shakespeare frequently left London when there was the plague in London, because when there was the plague in London, the theatres were closed, and that meant that the actors could not perform in the theatre. They had to go and tour. This is sort of by the by a little bit, and we don't do this much. We don't much refer to information that we have from outside the sonnets, but it's a little bit of context, and it may explain a little bit why suddenly I am going to be away again for an entire summer. And so this is where we are, and we are in we are now, I think, what we certainly notice from this change of tone, what we notice in this maturing of the relationship into something quite different, from this wide-eyed infatuation, from this unbelievable readiness to immediately forgive even the worst kind of behavior of the young man, to this much more mature, this much more assertive stance, this warning, take heed. Also a plea not to do it, not to keep doing this, but also a warning. And they're saying, look, there are limits now. Even the hardest knife can lose his edge. And this very strong language of sin and infection and shame and festering flowers. It's a change. And it's a new phase we've entered. And that makes me look forward to quite a few more. No longer that many. I can't say any more. There are many, many more. But there are quite a few more glorious and unbelievably fascinating sonnets to look forward to. And I hope, of course, that you will stay with me. Remember, love is the power. And see you next week.